The vicarage drawing-room smelt faintly of beeswax polish, damp hymn-books, and the sort of tea that had been left too long on a hot plate. A dozen respectable citizens of Flaxborough had assembled on that October afternoon for what was described as the preliminary sorting of raffle contributions. The term had an officious air, though in reality it meant rummaging through a heap of unwanted household ornaments, unopened boxes of chocolates, and a depressingly large number of bath salts gift sets. Mrs. Henshaw, the vicar's wife, presided with an expression that combined maternal benevolence with the resolute control of a battleship commander. She directed volunteers to the card table, stacked high with donations, a stuffed pheasant under glass, a bottle of sherry bearing a faded label, and more worryingly a small electrical appliance with its cord tied in 3 knots. Mrs. Henshaw pronounced it perfectly serviceable in the same tone she might have used for the Nicene Creed. The mood was warm, if faintly grudging. In Flaxborough, raffles had long since lost their aura of innocent fun. They were instead judged as opportunities for civic surveillance, who gave generously, who with embarrassing parsimony, and who, like Mrs. Pringle of the High Street, had the gall to offer, as a prize, the very same candlewick bedspread she had once won 3 raffles ago. Such facts were neither forgotten nor forgiven. It was amid this background of amiable scrutiny that the incident occurred. Miss Pumphrey, a retired milliner whose hats had once alarmed audiences at parish fêtes, held up a book of tickets she had purchased earlier in the day. She meant only to confirm her number with the vicar's wife, but as she peeled back the stapled cover, her narrow eyes widened. Instead of the expected neat roll of pink stubs, the book revealed a curious doubling. 2 sets of identical numbers ran side by side, 118 through 140 appearing twice, once in bold ink, once in fainter print. "Oh," Miss Pumphrey said with her usual air of grievance, "I declare this is most irregular." Her remark drew immediate attention, the way a wasp unsettles a picnic. The others craned to look. Mr. Willard, the bank clerk, sniffed in professional suspicion. Mrs. Henshaw's smile faltered, though she rallied swiftly with a suggestion that it was a misprint from the supplier. Yet the sight of duplicated numbers stirred something more insidious than disappointment. Whispers spread of dishonesty, of manipulation, of unfair advantage. The vicar himself, arriving late with a tray of rather damp sponge fingers, was confronted by a small but indignant chorus demanding explanation. His baffled protestation, surely a simple mistake, surely nothing intentional, had the effect of fanning rather than quelling the unease. For in Flaxborough, as every inhabitant knew, accidents were rarely believed to be accidental. By the time the sorting concluded, the scandal of the duplicated tickets had escaped into the chilly street. The butcher's wife carried it, wrapped in indignation, to her afternoon customers. A bank teller murmured it to a colleague, who later told his mother-in-law. And in less than an hour, the town's gossip system was faster than the telegraph, more enduring than the parish magazine had announced that the Vicarage Raffle was tainted by impropriety. Someone, it seemed, had been attempting to cheat. And while Inspector Purbright of the Flaxborough Police had not yet heard of this curious matter, it was making its patient way toward him, borne on currents of chatter and suspicion. Soon enough it would reach his desk, carried not with urgency, but with that polite inevitability that always accompanied small scandals in small towns. By the next morning, the affair of the raffle tickets had already swollen into something larger than itself. What had begun as Miss Pumphrey's querulous discovery was now being retailed as evidence of either financial irregularity or moral weakness at the very heart of the vicarage. The cooperative store's manager repeated to his assistant that he had it on good authority that the vicar himself had arranged duplicate books to ensure favourable odds for certain parishioners. The assistant, eager to improve the story, carried it on to a customer with the embellishment that the vicar's wife had been seen hiding tickets in a hymn book. At the same time, Mrs. Pringle, who was seldom content to let anyone else carry the day in scandal, contributed her version. She declared that one of the choir boys had already won a handsome basket of fruit in last year's raffle, despite not holding a ticket at all, and that the present muddle was therefore part of a longer pattern of dishonesty. She did not, of course, disclose that the basket had been donated by her cousin and consisted largely of windfall apples. By midday the gossip had reached the snug of the railway arms. Mr. Willard of the bank, having fortified himself with a pale ale, confided to the company that he would not be surprised if certain missing parish funds, about which there had been whisperings 2 years ago, had found their way into this latest episode. A retired postmaster shook his head gravely, remarking that organized crime had a way of insinuating itself into even the most respectable communities. The suggestion was met with solemn nods, though nobody could quite recall a previous case in Flaxborough of anything more organized than a poacher's cart. Through all this, the vicar maintained a troubled silence. He walked about the town with his usual unhurried step, though his smile seemed strained, as if he felt each greeting carried an unspoken accusation. Mrs. Henshaw attempted to reassure him by proclaiming to anyone who would listen that the duplication of tickets must surely have been a printer's mishap. Yet each time she said it, the phrase printer's mishap sounded more like a carefully chosen euphemism for wrongdoing than an explanation. It was in this state of simmering speculation that the matter at last came to the notice of Inspector Purbright, not through any official complaint nor by a formal report, but by way of Sergeant Love's hesitant description over morning tea. The sergeant had been apprised of the scandal by his landlady, who insisted that the raffle was on the brink of collapse and that the honour of the parish was at stake. Purbright listened with mild interest, stirring his tea with a patient rhythm. When Love concluded with the assertion that they're saying it might be fraud, sir, the inspector merely raised his brows and remarked that such was quite an elevation for a few sheets of pink paper. Nevertheless, he did not dismiss it. He had lived long enough in Flaxborough to know that where there was smoke there was not necessarily fire, but there was often something smouldering vanity, resentment, or a small grudge, long disguised as respectability. He closed the notebook on his desk, adjusted his spectacles, and told Love that it might be best to have a word with those most directly involved. Quiet words, naturally. No need for the public to imagine that Scotland Yard had been summoned to adjudicate a parish raffle. And so, while the town continued its industrious work of embroidering the tale into ever more colourful threads, Purbright prepared to move gently among its weavers, listening not for the loud declarations of scandal, but for the small hesitations and slips that hinted at a truth less dramatic, but far more instructive. Inspector Purbright's first call, made with the deliberate calm that was his habitual way of deflating public excitement, was to the vicarage itself. He chose a time when he judged the household likely to be recovering from lunch, reasoning that both the vicar and his wife might be in a state of lull, less prone to defensive flourishes. The vicar, a man whose appearance suggested that sermons pressed rather heavily upon his digestion, opened the door with a face of such strained geniality that Purbright at once felt confirmed in his choice. He was invited into the drawing-room, still faintly redolent of sponge fingers and the robust polish Mrs. Henshaw applied to all visible furniture. The vicar's wife entered briskly, clasping her hands in the manner of one preparing to defend her family against judicial assault. Purbright, after remarking on the pleasant autumn weather and inquiring whether the dahlias in the garden had survived the recent frost, permitted the conversation to drift toward the raffle. He did so as if the subject was scarcely of interest, which had the immediate effect of compelling Mrs. Henshaw to treat it as vitally important. She explained, in a voice both emphatic and suspicious, that the matter was nothing more than a misprint, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was guilty of slander. Her husband murmured agreement, though without the conviction of one who entirely believed in providential printing errors. Purbright asked whether the ticket books had been purchased locally. The vicar's eyes darted nervously toward his wife, who replied with chilly precision that they had been ordered from a supplier in Leicester, a reputable firm recommended by another parish. The inspector nodded, making no comment. He then inquired whether the books had been kept securely before distribution. The vicar, looking almost guilty at the question, stammered that they had been left in the vestry cupboard, which was locked most of the time. Mrs. Henshaw interrupted to say that in any case there could be no possible advantage in duplicating numbers, since the drawer was conducted openly and everyone's stubs went into the same tin. Purbright agreed that this was a reasonable point, but observed with mild interest that confusion of numbers might lead to disputed claims for prizes. Mrs. Henshaw's lips tightened. She insisted that no such dispute would be tolerated. Winners would be determined by the vicar's own eye, which she implied was infallible. Leaving the vicarage, Purbright felt no more enlightened about the cause of the duplication, but considerably more informed about the state of tension within the household. The vicar seemed oppressed, almost fearful, whereas his wife was combative, as though defending a fortress. Neither attitude suggested the serene innocence of people who believed themselves untouched by suspicion. He strolled back to the police station, considering that the next step should be to hear from those who had first noticed the irregularity. Miss Pumphrey was encountered in her neat little terraced house, where she received the inspector with the delight of someone who believed her grievance had at last been accorded official recognition. She launched into a detailed description of the defective ticket book, producing it with the solemnity of a coronial exhibit. Purbright examined the pages carefully. The duplication was indeed clear numbers repeated, the ink of one sequence slightly paler than the other, as though printed on a different day. He remarked upon this, and Miss Pumphrey leaned forward eagerly, declaring that she had always suspected the vicarage of dubious practices. She cited as evidence the time Mrs. Henshaw had accidentally won a set of embroidered tea towels, and another occasion when the vicar's niece, visiting from Lincoln, had taken home a joint of beef. Purbright listened politely, making a few notes, though his eyes twinkled faintly at the extravagance of her suspicions. From Miss Pumphrey he proceeded to the Railway Arms, where Sergeant Love had suggested several townsfolk might be gathered for their afternoon half-pint. There he found Mr. Willard, the bank clerk, who was only too willing to share his misgivings. In a tone of mournful authority, he explained that such duplications could be the thin end of the wedge, leading inevitably to financial scandal. He implied that he alone possessed the mathematical acumen to appreciate this, and he would not be surprised if funds had gone astray in other areas of parish finance. Purbright allowed him to ramble, noting that Mr. Willard seemed more anxious to parade his sense of superiority than to provide facts. The retired postmaster also contributed his view, suggesting that the matter might involve counterfeiters. He spoke darkly of criminal gangs infiltrating small towns, though when pressed could recall no instance of such infiltration beyond the theft of a parcel of tobacco 30 years earlier. The inspector thanked him gravely for his vigilance. What emerged from these conversations was not a body of evidence, but a haze of suspicion, coloured by personal grievances. Yet within that haze, Purbright discerned a small pattern. The duplication was not viewed as a meaningless error, but as an opportunity seized by someone. That someone might not be clever, but he or she would be motivated by a combination of greed and the confidence that the town's appetite for gossip would obscure the simple truth. Over the following days, Purbright conducted a series of unobtrusive interviews. He spoke to Mrs. Pringle, who, while ostentatiously washing her front step, confided that she had always said raffles were a temptation to sin. He asked the choir boys whether they had seen anyone tampering with the ticket books, which provoked giggles and denials. He inquired at the stationer's shop whether duplicate numbering was common. The shopkeeper, after prolonged reflection, declared it was most unusual, though printers occasionally made mistakes if rushed. The inspector thanked him and bought a pencil to justify the call. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was increasingly anxious that they should take stronger action. He suggested seizing all the ticket books or at least postponing the raffle until the matter was cleared up. Purbright, however, preferred to let events unfold. "A raffle," he remarked gently, "is not unlike a conversation. The longer it goes on, the more likely it is that somebody will say something they had not meant to." Love looked doubtful, but accepted his superior's quiet authority. Indeed, Purbright's patience was soon rewarded. Word reached him, by way of the butcher's wife, that another duplication had been found in a separate book of tickets. This time the discovery was made not by Miss Pumphrey, but by Mrs. Pringle herself, who displayed the offending booklet to half the congregation after evensong. The revelation produced a new round of outrage. People began to suggest that tickets purchased in good faith might be worthless, that the entire raffle might collapse. The vicarage was besieged with complaints, and Mrs. Henshaw, though defiant, could not entirely conceal the strain. Purbright took possession of the second faulty booklet and compared it with the first. Again the duplication was present, though in a different range of numbers. The paper was of the same stock, but he noticed that the staple was of slightly different metal, brighter and more robust. This small inconsistency intrigued him. He made a quiet note and slipped the booklet into a drawer. The affair had now become more than a curiosity. If two books were affected, then either the printer was at fault, or someone locally had contrived to tamper with the stock. Purbright inclined toward the latter. He recalled the vicar's hesitation when asked about the security of the vestry cupboard. A cupboard, locked most of the time, was, in practice, open enough of the time to accommodate a meddler. One afternoon he returned discreetly to the church, asking to be shown the vestry. The vicar, flustered but obliging, produced the key. The cupboard was a solid oak piece with a respectable lock. Inside were several untouched bundles of tickets neatly stacked. Purbright examined one at random. Its numbering was flawless. He replaced it carefully and remarked that the vicar was fortunate to have such a diligent parish. The vicar looked both relieved and uncertain, as though unsure whether he had been complimented or gently rebuked. Leaving the vestry, Purbright encountered Mrs. Henshaw on the porch. She fixed him with a sharp look and inquired whether he had discovered the miscreant yet. Purbright replied mildly that investigations took time and that often the truth revealed itself by degrees, much like a hymn sung through all its verses. She gave a curt nod, clearly unsatisfied, and swept past him with an air of moral indignation. As he walked back through the town, Purbright reflected upon the nature of such indignation. It was a weapon frequently deployed in Flaxborough, not merely to defend oneself, but to ensure that others trembled. He considered that Mrs. Henshaw's ferocity might conceal fear, yet fear of what? The loss of reputation, certainly, but perhaps also the exposure of some quiet arrangement that had seemed harmless until now. Meanwhile, the townspeople grew more agitated. The raffle was due to take place in less than a fortnight, and tickets were still being sold, though with nervous jokes about whether they might be genuine. Some refused to buy more, declaring that they would not support a corrupt system. Others bought with increased enthusiasm, gambling that a duplication might double their chances. The scandal, instead of destroying the raffle, seemed to invigorate it, drawing in the curious and the mischievous. Purbright, observing this, smiled faintly. It was characteristic of human nature, he thought, that a tainted game attracted more players than a spotless one. He decided that the time had come to expand his inquiries beyond the vicarage and its immediate circle. Someone, somewhere, had gained from this muddle, and it was not likely to be the printer in Leicester. No, the culprit was closer to home, and the truth lay hidden not in the ticket books themselves, but in the tangled motives of those who surrounded them. The days that followed brought Inspector Purbright a steady trickle of information, not through official channels, but by the town's more natural means of transmission, overheard comments, half-formed suspicions, and the faintly self-righteous reports of those who believed they had discerned guilt where others saw only muddle. The scandal of the duplicate raffle tickets had now passed into the hands of people for whom scandal was not so much an unpleasant occurrence as an invigorating pastime. In parlours, shops and pubs, theories multiplied like geranium cuttings. Some were so improbable that even the tellers seemed embarrassed, while others were presented with such confident authority that they began to gather a fragile life of their own. Purbright, sitting at his desk in the station, listened to Sergeant Love's earnest recitations of the latest rumours with the expression of a man attending a particularly long sermon. The sergeant was convinced, for instance, that the local printer's apprentice must be involved, having apparently been seen with a pocketful of ticket stubs while loitering near the church. When pressed, Love admitted that the witness to this sighting was Mrs. Pringle, and that she had not been close enough to distinguish raffle tickets from tramway transfers. Purbright observed mildly that tramway transfers were not in fashion in Flaxborough, which prompted Love to backtrack and suggest that the boy might instead have been collecting cigarette cards. In any case, Love concluded, the presence of paper in his pockets was suspicious. Purbright nodded gravely, though his eyes betrayed amusement. The inspector's amusement did not prevent him from considering the wider implications. The duplication of tickets, clumsy though it seemed, had already provided fertile ground for accusations. The obvious suspects in the town's collective imagination were the vicar and his wife. Their position at the centre of parish life made them vulnerable to criticism. A raffle in Flaxborough was more than a game of chance. It was a test of moral authority. If the raffle faltered, so too did the prestige of the vicarage. Yet Purbright was unconvinced that either of the Henshaws, officious and anxious as they might be, would have risked so public a humiliation for such a meagre prize as a basket of groceries or a bottle of sherry. Human folly could indeed be small, but it tended to conceal itself with greater care. His attention began to turn instead toward those who stood to benefit quietly from a discredited raffle. If enough doubt was cast upon the tickets, then claims might be disputed. Disputed claims, in turn, could be settled in ways advantageous to someone with access to the prizes or to the money raised. Such speculation was delicate, for it demanded a knowledge not of mechanics or numbers, but of temperament, the jealousies, conceits, and ambitions that animated Flaxborough society. To explore these subtler regions, Purbright made a point of calling one evening upon Mr. Willard, the bank clerk, who had been most vocal in airing suspicions. The visit was framed as a courtesy, for Purbright asked the man's advice on whether raffle proceeds should properly be deposited before or after the draw. Mr. Willard, flattered to be consulted, discoursed at length upon the dangers of keeping cash in unsecured tins. He took the opportunity to suggest that certain parties in the parish committee were lax in such matters. Purbright allowed him to continue, and soon Mr. Willard had wandered into a confession of his own grievance that he had once proposed himself for treasurer, but had been overlooked in favour of a local shopkeeper. This oversight, he implied, had exposed the committee to all manner of errors. Purbright left with the impression that Mr. Willard's outrage at the raffle's supposed dishonesty owed less to love of truth than to disappointment at being excluded from the handling of money. The shopkeeper in question, a Mr. Caldecott, proved a more difficult subject. When Purbright dropped in under the pretext of buying stationery, the man grew visibly nervous at the mention of raffle accounts. He protested that all sums collected were kept scrupulously separate from his own till, and that the vicar had signed each ledger entry. Purbright, whose interest in the ledgers was at that moment minimal, simply nodded and observed the man's manner. Nervousness in itself was not evidence of guilt, but it was an interesting accompaniment to protestations of virtue. As these polite inquiries continued, the town council decided that the raffle must not be postponed. The prizes had already been displayed in the church hall, and to cancel would suggest weakness. Better to press forward, they reasoned, and hoped the excitement dwindled. But the decision had precisely the opposite effect. The sight of the prizes, some trivial, some faintly desirable, served only to sharpen speculation about how they might be won, or indeed lost, depending on the legitimacy of the tickets. The scandal was refreshed, and once again Miss Pumphrey found herself consulted by neighbours eager to hear the story from its first discoverer. She told it with such relish that the duplication seemed almost to have been her personal achievement. By this time, Purbright had accumulated a small collection of faulty ticket books, each brought to him by citizens keen to demonstrate their vigilance. He examined them carefully, noting that while the numbers repeated, the handwriting of the counterfoils varied. It was evident that more than one hand had been involved in writing names. This suggested that the duplication had been unnoticed at the time of sale, discovered only when purchasers compared notes. He began to suspect that the true manipulation, if manipulation there was, might not lie in the printing of the tickets, but in their distribution. The inspector's reflections were interrupted one morning by Sergeant Love, who entered with the eager air of a man who believed he carried decisive news. Love reported that Mrs. Henshaw had been overheard in the greengrocer's declaring she would make certain of winning the set of cutlery this year. The remark, passed along through 3 intermediaries, had acquired the weight of confession. Purbright asked mildly whether the sergeant had considered that the remark might have been ironic. Love admitted that irony was not easily detected in Mrs. Henshaw's tone. Purbright suggested that irony was indeed a rare commodity in Flaxborough, and that its absence should not be mistaken for crime. Still, the possibility that someone intended to secure a particular prize by means of the duplicated tickets could not be ignored. If 2 people claimed the same winning number, the prize might be awarded not by chance but by influence, by the persuasive authority of one claimant over another. And in such contests of persuasion, Mrs. Henshaw would certainly be formidable. Determined to observe her in a less formal setting, Purbright attended the parish sewing circle under the pretext of delivering a message. He lingered long enough to witness Mrs. Henshaw directing the distribution of tea and biscuits with the severity of a field marshal. When the conversation turned to the raffle, she dismissed concerns with a wave of her hand, assuring the company that honesty would prevail. The phrase, uttered with such certainty, struck Purbright as oddly rehearsed, as though intended to forestall doubt rather than express confidence. Later that evening, as he walked home through the dimly lit streets, Purbright considered the curious balance of appearances. On one hand, Mrs. Henshaw's fierce defence of the raffle might mark her as the most obvious suspect. On the other, such open insistence could just as well be a shield against suspicion directed elsewhere. He recalled her earlier question to him in the church porch. Had he discovered the miscreant yet, and wondered whether she had asked in fear of being named or in hope of seeing someone else exposed? In the quiet of his office the next morning, Purbright arranged the ticket books before him. He studied them with the patience of a man piecing together a slow puzzle. The repeated numbers, the slight differences in ink, the variety of staples, these small inconsistencies might not reveal a mastermind, but they pointed to deliberate interference. He felt, rather than knew, that someone had tampered with the books after they arrived from Leicester. The question was not so much how, but why and for whom. At that moment, Sergeant Love entered with yet another morsel of intelligence. A local widow, Mrs. Hornbeam, claimed she had bought 3 books of tickets from different sellers, each containing at least one duplicated number. More intriguingly, she insisted that the books had been offered to her at a discount, with the suggestion that bulk purchases might help the cause. Purbright listened with new interest. A discount on raffle tickets was an oddity. It implied either desperation to raise money quickly or a private profit motive. He instructed Love to make a list of all those authorized to sell tickets. The list, when compiled, revealed a striking fact: the majority of books sold at reduced prices had passed through the hands of one committee member, a Mr. Gedge, known for his enthusiasm in fundraising and his rather lax accounting. Purbright recalled Gedge as a man of hearty manners and booming laugh, who seemed to insert himself into every town event with the zeal of a man guarding a personal investment. His shop, a modest drapery on the high street, was often filled with chatter, and he was precisely the sort who might view the raffle not merely as a charitable venture, but as an opportunity for clever manipulation. Yet nothing about him suggested subtle criminality. He was not secretive but expansive, not cautious but impulsive. It was just such impulsiveness, Purbright reflected, that might lead a man to believe he could outwit an entire town by tinkering with ticket books. Still, Purbright withheld judgment. Appearances, however suggestive, were not proof. He instructed Love to make further quiet inquiries about Gedge's handling of ticket sales. Meanwhile, he himself paid a visit to the drapery, where he was greeted with effusive hospitality. Gedge insisted on showing him rolls of fabric and extolling their durability. When Purbright mentioned the raffle, Gedge laughed loudly and declared it the finest means ever devised of bringing folk together. Yet as he spoke, his eyes darted momentarily toward a cupboard behind the counter. It was the sort of fleeting glance that might pass unnoticed by most, but not by Purbright. He left the shop with no evidence, but with a sharpened instinct. In Flaxborough, guilt was rarely displayed in the obvious manner of confession. It appeared instead in small betrayals of composure, in hurried justifications, in the accidental choice of a word. The inspector knew that to expose such guilt he would need not bluster or accusation, but patience, and perhaps a question asked at precisely the right moment. As he returned to the station, he thought again of the duplicated numbers. They were not merely a printing flaw, they were a signpost, pointing toward a motive not yet fully revealed. And Purbright, content to wait, understood that the town itself would continue to press upon the culprit, until at last some slip would provide the thread he needed to unravel the whole affair. Inspector Purbright's conviction that Mr. Gedge's cheerful drapery counter concealed more than bolts of fabric grew slowly, like a bruise spreading under the skin. He was careful not to confide this conviction to Sergeant Love, who, in his loyal eagerness, might have blurted it about the town in a way that would ruin everything. Love, in any case, was still preoccupied with Mrs. Henshaw's supposed determination to secure the cutlery. He had developed a theory that she was in league with the printer's apprentice, and though the apprentice in question had stoutly denied any knowledge of printing presses beyond those that produced the Flaxborough Chronicle, Love remained suspicious. Purbright let him persist. A misdirected theory, the inspector knew, could be useful cover for a sounder one kept quietly in reserve. The raffle's approach lent a certain urgency to the inquiry, but urgency in Flaxborough never manifested as haste. Rather, it appeared in the quickening gossip of the shops, the lowered voices in the pews, and the half-fearful, half-eager question, that everyone now asked who had tampered with the sacred books of tickets. Suspicion was the town's favourite spice, and it was now sprinkled liberally upon neighbours who only days earlier had been deemed models of respectability. One chilly afternoon, Purbright strolled past the drapery shop again, this time pausing to admire a window display of rather forlorn woolen shawls. Through the glass, he observed Gedge bustling about with a customer, laughing in that booming way of his, as though every transaction were a comedy in several acts. Yet the inspector also noticed, in a corner near the till, a cardboard box half hidden under a cloth. Its shape and size were suspiciously similar to the ticket bundles he had handled in the vestry cupboard. The sight did not surprise him, but it confirmed his sense that Gedge had enjoyed freer access to the tickets than anyone else outside the vicarage. Later that day, Purbright called discreetly upon Mrs. Hornbeam, the widow who had spoken of bulk purchases offered at a discount. She received him in a room heavy with antimacassars and the faint odour of lavender polish. She was only too eager to repeat her story, insisting that Mr. Gedge himself had persuaded her to take 3 books for the price of 2. "All for the cause, Inspector," she mimicked his hearty tone, "and a chance for you to win that fruit basket." She had bought them, she said, not because she craved the prizes, but because she wished to be considered generous. Purbright listened gravely, nodding at intervals, and left with the sense that generosity had been less at stake than the widow's terror of being thought stingy. The inspector's next visit was to the Flaxborough Chronicle office, where the editor, Mr. Bristow, greeted him with a look of sly expectation. The Chronicle had been receiving letters on the subject of the raffle, and Bristow had been tempted to print them, but hesitated for fear of libel. He did, however, provide Purbright with a sheaf of drafts. They contained accusations against the vicar, against Mrs. Henshaw, against Gedge, and even against the choir boys whose supposed involvement in mischief was a recurring theme. One anonymous correspondent suggested that the raffle had been infiltrated by subversives, though what subversives hoped to achieve by winning a basket of groceries was not explained. Purbright thanked Bristow, pocketed the drafts, and remarked that sometimes letters told more about the writer than about the subject. Bristow nodded, secretly pleased at the prospect of the police becoming entangled in what promised to be excellent copy. It was becoming increasingly clear to Purbright that the scandal was no longer simply about tickets. It was about trust, about who in the town might be quietly greedy, who might be careless, and who might simply be unlucky. And in this web of suspicion, Gedge stood at the centre, not because he was clever, but because he was noisy, and noise in Flaxborough often hid clumsiness. Purbright decided to test him not directly, but in a way that would expose his instincts. He arranged, through an acquaintance on the raffle committee, that Gedge should deliver a bundle of tickets to a parishioner in Purbright's presence. The meeting took place in the parish hall. Gedge strode in with the bundle tucked under his arm, his smile as broad as ever. He handed the tickets over with a flourish, assuring the parishioner that these were the best odds in town. Purbright, watching closely, remarked gently that surely all tickets had the same chance of winning. Gedge faltered for a moment, then laughed loudly, and insisted he had meant only that the lady had the good fortune of being early. The pause was brief, but telling. Gedge had revealed a glimmer of calculation beneath his joviality, and Purbright filed it away for later. Meanwhile, the town's appetite for speculation produced another twist. Miss Pumphrey, emboldened by her role as the first discoverer of the duplication, began circulating a story that the faulty books had been smuggled into Flaxborough under cover of darkness. She claimed to have seen a cart unloading suspicious bundles outside the drapery at midnight. When challenged on the matter, she admitted that the cart had in fact been delivering firewood, but she insisted that something untoward had been hidden beneath the logs. Her certainty spread among her circle, and by the end of the week it was generally believed that a clandestine delivery had indeed occurred. Purbright, hearing this, smiled wearily. Flaxborough's imagination, once lit, burned brighter than any evidence. In contrast to Miss Pumphrey's fantasies, Mrs. Pringle offered a more practical accusation. She told anyone who would listen that the entire raffle had been designed from the beginning to cheat her personally. She produced as proof the fact that her last 3 ticket purchases had failed to win so much as a tin of biscuits. A pattern like that, she declared, is not a coincidence. Purbright, hearing of this complaint, concluded that Mrs. Pringle had merely rediscovered the principle of probability, though in a form more suited to her grievances than to mathematics. The atmosphere in the town grew thick with such recriminations, and it became impossible for anyone to mention the raffle without provoking a flurry of speculation. To outsiders, the whole matter might have seemed ludicrous, but within Flaxborough it had become a trial of honour. To win a prize was no longer merely to obtain a basket of groceries, but to demonstrate that one's integrity was unassailable. To lose, or to be cheated, was to risk humiliation. The stakes had risen far above the actual value of the prizes. Purbright, aware of this, realized that the culprit, whoever it might be, was playing a dangerous game. For while Flaxborough was indulgent of small vanities, it was merciless toward exposed deceit. The town would forgive drunkenness, quarrels, even occasional theft, but it would not forgive the manipulation of a raffle. That was a social compact too sacred to be trifled with. Whoever had interfered with the tickets had underestimated the town's collective sense of righteousness. With this thought in mind, Purbright decided to revisit the vestry cupboard. He wished to see whether any further interference had occurred since his last inspection. The vicar, summoned once more, produced the key with trembling hands. Inside, the bundles were still neatly arranged, but Purbright noticed one curious detail. The dust upon the shelf was disturbed. Someone had been there recently. He drew a finger across the surface, noting the fresh streaks. The vicar swore he had not opened the cupboard in weeks, and Mrs. Henshaw, when consulted, insisted she alone held the key besides her husband. Purbright did not contradict her, but he considered the possibility that copies had been made, or that the cupboard was not as secure as the vicar imagined. Back at the station, he summoned Sergeant Love and instructed him to keep a discreet watch on the drapery shop in the evenings. Love was delighted at the assignment, though disappointed that it did not involve immediate arrests. Purbright warned him to be subtle. "Think of yourself," he advised, "as a lamppost that happens to observe." Love, uncertain of the metaphor, promised to do his best. The surveillance yielded little at first. Gedge closed his shop punctually, and no mysterious carts appeared. But on the 3rd evening, Love reported seeing him leave by the back door carrying a box under his arm. The sergeant had been too far away to follow without revealing himself, but he swore it resembled the same box Purbright had glimpsed near the till. The inspector listened thoughtfully, then suggested they wait. "A box carried at dusk," he remarked, "is not yet a crime. It is merely a fact. Let us see what sort of facts accumulate." Purbright's patience was soon rewarded. A day later, one of the raffle committee members came to him in some distress. She had purchased a block of tickets from Gedge, only to discover that every single one bore a number ending in 7. When she had queried this oddity, Gedge had assured her that 7s were lucky. She had not been convinced, and now she wondered whether she had been swindled. Purbright took the tickets, examined them, and concealed a smile. This was no accident of printing, but the deliberate choice of someone who believed superstition might justify tampering. It was clumsy, but revealing. It showed that Gedge, or whoever had meddled with the books, was not merely careless, but superstitious enough to think luck could be manufactured. By now the evidence was pointing steadily in one direction, yet Purbright refrained from drawing conclusions. He knew too well that in Flaxborough the most obvious villain was often a decoy, and that guilt could be distributed in unexpected ways. Still he felt the circle tightening. The raffle was only days away, and with it would come the moment when duplications could no longer be ignored. If the draw produced contested claims, the scandal would reach its climax. It was then, Purbright thought, that the true culprit would betray himself not by cunning, but by panic. And so he waited, content to let the town simmer. He knew that the longer suspicion brewed, the more likely it was that someone would stumble into exposure. In Flaxborough, crimes were rarely solved by grand revelations. They were uncovered by the gentle pressure of gossip, by the slips of tongue that betrayed a hidden anxiety. The raffle scandal, absurd though it might appear, was no different. Beneath the duplicate numbers lay something more telling of the very human urge to seize advantage in a world where reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. The atmosphere in Flaxborough during the week leading up to the raffle became increasingly dense, like a parlour filled with too many gas lamps, each giving off more heat than illumination. The duplicated ticket affair had grown so entangled in conjecture that it was difficult to separate fact from embroidery. What had begun with Miss Pumphrey's discovery was now a drama in which everyone, from the postman to the charwoman, played some role, whether as witness, accuser, or supposed victim. Inspector Purbright, watching this swirl of half-truths and suspicions, remained characteristically unhurried. He understood that the town's chatter, while rarely accurate, had a way of loosening tongues and revealing private grievances that, in their accumulation, edged closer to the truth. It was in this spirit that he paid calls upon several figures not directly connected with the raffle, but whose opinions, he judged, would shed light on the wider field of motives. He began with Dr. Hilliard, the local physician, who received him in a consulting room that smelled faintly of liniment and boiled cabbage. The doctor, a man whose manner alternated between pompous certainty and furtive doubt, was eager to confide that he suspected hypochondria, rather than fraud, to be at the root of Flaxborough's ailments. Most of these people, he said with a sniff, would invent disease if they thought it gave them social standing. Why not invent scandal too? Purbright, resisting a smile, asked whether the doctor believed any particular person had cause to manipulate the raffle. Hilliard pursed his lips and declared that Mrs. Pringle, in her ceaseless campaign for recognition, was capable of anything short of poisoning. He added, however, that Mr. Gedge's hearty exterior concealed a dangerous love of schemes. Purbright thanked him, reflecting that doctors were often better at diagnosing character than illness. From there he walked to the library, a building whose silence was broken only by the coughs of readers intent on appearing scholarly. The librarian, Miss Bellamy, proved surprisingly well informed about parish matters. She suggested, in a whisper, that managed to be both confidential and broadcast, that the duplication might be part of an effort to undermine the vicar himself. There are those, she confided, who would dearly like to see the Henshaws humbled. The raffle could be their opportunity. She would not name names, but her pointed glance toward the drapery shop, visible across the square, required no commentary. Purbright borrowed a book on local history to justify his call and departed, thinking how conveniently the town had decided that Gedge embodied both cause and consequence of mischief. Yet the inspector did not wish to confine his inquiries to obvious suspects. He knew that small crimes often grew from petty grievances, and these grievances might lie hidden in unexpected quarters. So he took to walking the town in the late afternoons, pausing to speak with tradesmen, errand girls, and anyone inclined to share gossip. From these conversations a pattern began to emerge. Several people mentioned that Gedge had lately seemed unusually prosperous. His wife wore a new coat, his shop had fresh paint, and there were rumours he had taken delivery of expensive cloth beyond the usual quality of his stock. None of this proved anything, but in a town where prosperity was usually measured in the careful reddening of socks, such displays were bound to raise eyebrows. Meanwhile, Sergeant Love grew increasingly impatient. He pressed Purbright almost daily for action, insisting that they ought to seize Gedge's ledgers or question him more directly. Purbright, sipping tea and regarding his sergeant with benign patience, reminded him that premature accusations could ruin reputations unjustly. "In Flaxborough," he explained, "reputation is more enduring than fact. If we accuse the wrong person, truth will not rescue them later." Love muttered agreement, but could not conceal his frustration. He yearned for decisive blows, while his superior preferred the steady accumulation of threads until a knot tied itself. The knot, when it began to tighten, did so from an unexpected direction. One evening, just as the lamps were being lit along the high street, Mrs. Hornbeam again presented herself at the station. She looked flustered, even alarmed. She confessed that she had discovered in one of her books of tickets a number already, claimed by another parishioner. She had confronted the man who insisted that his booklet had been purchased weeks earlier. The two had quarrelled loudly enough that half the street overheard. Now Mrs. Hornbeam feared she would be accused of dishonesty. She appealed to Purbright to clear her name. He calmed her with his usual gentleness, promising that no guilt should attach to her. Yet inwardly he recognized that the affair had entered a more dangerous phase. Disputes were no longer abstract. They were personal, with neighbours openly accusing one another. Purbright decided the time had come to widen his net still further. He visited Mr. Caldecott, the shopkeeper-treasurer, in his little back office. The man, surrounded by ledgers, appeared exhausted, as though the very figures oppressed him. He admitted after some hesitation that he had noticed discrepancies in the count of tickets received from Gedge. Bundles supposed to contain 100 sometimes had 98 or 102. He had mentioned this once to Mrs. Henshaw, but she had dismissed it as trivial. Purbright listened carefully, recognizing that such minor irregularities, overlooked by most, were the very signs that pointed toward tampering. He thanked Caldecott, whose relief at being taken seriously was almost touching. Later that week, Purbright chose to walk home by way of the churchyard, a route less frequented at night. There he encountered the vicar himself, pacing with a bowed head. The man looked weary, like one who bore a burden heavier than duplicated tickets. At the inspector's polite inquiry, he confessed that the scandal was ruining his peace. Parishioners treated him with guarded courtesy. Even old friends looked at him with veiled suspicion. He spoke of resignation, of retreating to a smaller parish where such indignities might not pursue him. Purbright listened with sympathy, though he doubted the vicar had either the energy or the guile to be the source of mischief. Still he knew that despair could make men careless, and carelessness was sometimes indistinguishable from guilt. The following morning brought another small revelation. Sergeant Love, in the course of his desultory watch near the drapery, had seen a boy carrying a sheaf of what looked like ticket stubs into the back entrance. Love, anxious to act, demanded permission to search. Purbright refused, but he noted the incident. A boy carrying scraps of paper was no crime, but it suggested that discarded or altered tickets might be passing through the shop. If Gedge was not the culprit, then someone within his orbit was certainly playing a dangerous game. The inspector pondered these fragments late into the evening, his office lit only by the glow of a single lamp. He considered the motives of each player, Mrs. Henshaw's fierce defence of propriety, Mr. Willard's thwarted ambition, Mrs. Pringle's perpetual grievances, Gedge's hearty opportunism. Each had reason to wish the raffle bent. to their advantage. Yet it was not ambition alone that created duplications, it was access and opportunity. Of these, Gedge possessed more than anyone. The inspector resolved to let the raffle proceed, convinced that the moment of the draw would bring clarity. In public competitions, he reflected, dishonesty always revealed itself most plainly at the instant of supposed triumph. And so Flaxborough continued its restless wait, the townsfolk eager for the day when prizes would be drawn and justice, in one form or another, would be seen to prevail. For them, the raffle was no longer about soap or sherry or cutlery. It was about honour, about the exposure of deceit, about the triumph of order over chaos. And for Inspector Purbright, seated quietly at his desk, it was about the slow unravelling of human nature, which he knew never failed to provide more material than the most elaborate crime. The week drew on toward the day of the raffle, and the air of Flaxborough was thick with expectation, as though the town itself were holding its breath. The scandal had ceased to be merely a matter of duplicated numbers. It had become a public trial in which each citizen imagined himself both juror and witness. Shops echoed with speculation. Children in the schoolyard traded stories of ticket tampering with as much relish as they once reserved for ghost tales. Purbright, in his steady, unshowy way, let the talk run its course, knowing that gossip, like a river, often carried useful fragments to those patient enough to sift them from the silt. It was 2 days before the raffle when the second incident occurred, shifting the course of events in a way no one could ignore. Mr. Caldecott, the weary treasurer, had been tallying the latest proceeds in the back room of his shop. As he counted, he noticed that several of the pound notes bore an odd similarity. The serial numbers were consecutive, something unusual for cash handed in by a dozen different sellers. Disturbed, he traced the notes to a batch delivered by none other than Gedge. When Caldecott asked, Gedge had laughed heartily and claimed they must all have come from the same generous donor. Yet the explanation rang hollow. Caldecott, for all his nervousness, was not a fool. He suspected the notes had never passed through parishioners' hands at all, but had been placed directly by Gedge to cover discrepancies in his accounts. That same evening, unable to sleep, Caldecott trudged to the police station with the notes wrapped in brown paper. He presented them to Purbright with the solemnity of a man confessing sin. Purbright examined the bundle carefully, then thanked him and offered tea. While the treasurer sipped nervously, the inspector asked gentle questions about the handling of money. Caldecott admitted that Gedge often collected cash late at night, and that he had more than once adjusted the books with surprisingly round figures. These admissions troubled Purbright less for their content than for what they suggested. If Gedge was prepared to manipulate accounts, the raffle tickets themselves might be only a part of his wider schemes. Yet Purbright was cautious. A neat suspect was rarely the correct one in Flaxborough. He recalled the vicar's weariness, the librarian's whispered hints of malice, the doctor's dismissal of half the town as potential frauds. Gedge might be guilty of opportunism, perhaps of clumsy dishonesty, but the duplicated tickets themselves remained unexplained. To balance his view, Purbright resolved to make further inquiries outside the immediate circle of suspects. The following afternoon, he visited the modest house of Mr. Sykes, a retired schoolmaster who kept himself aloof from parish committees but observed them with sardonic amusement. Sykes, pouring weak tea into cracked cups, assured the inspector that Gedge was indeed a rascal, but no cleverer than a crow stealing spoons. "If there is fraud, Inspector," he said with dry conviction, "it will be the work of someone quieter. The loud ones are distractions. Watch the ones who smile little and listen much." Purbright accepted this advice with a nod. He left pondering whether Sykes had meant anyone in particular, or whether the remark was the detached philosophy of a man content to see folly in others without involving himself. The second incident began to spread through town in whispers. Though Caldecott had spoken discreetly, the news of suspicious banknotes seeped out as surely as water through a cracked jug. Within a day, it was common knowledge that Gedge's accounts were in question. Some declared it proof of his guilt, while others, loyal to his booming laugh and cheap haberdashery, defended him as the victim of envy. The division deepened, and for the first time, Flaxborough found itself not united in condemnation, but split into factions. It lent the scandal a sharper edge, as though the town itself had been forced to take sides in a quarrel it barely understood. Amid this, Purbright pursued another lead. He had asked Sergeant Love to review the list of raffle sellers, paying particular attention to those who had handled large numbers of tickets. One name stood out: Mrs. Hornbeam. She had, by her own account, purchased multiple books, but Love's tally showed she had also sold far more than expected. When questioned, she admitted she had distributed extra books on behalf of Gedge, who had assured her it was permissible. She had thought nothing of it at the time, but now, with the scandal deepening, she feared she had been made a pawn. Her face, then, when she spoke, was pinched with the anxiety of one who feared losing not only reputation, but the fragile social approval she had worked so hard to maintain. Purbright thanked her, and made no accusation, yet in his mind the pattern was becoming clearer. The duplicated tickets, the odd serial numbers, the distribution through intermediaries, all pointed to deliberate interference, but interference conducted with a mixture of boldness and ineptitude. Whoever orchestrated it had relied on the town's reluctance to challenge jovial explanations, while lacking the foresight to cover tracks properly. It was a curious blend of cunning and foolishness. That night, as Purbright sat with his pipe, he considered again the nature of Flaxborough's misdeeds. They were rarely grand crimes, rather they were small insanities of pride, envy, or greed, exaggerated by the town's obsessive watchfulness. The raffle scandal was proving no different. Behind the duplications lay not professional criminality, but the familiar human need to appear fortunate, to secure advantage, to boast of triumph. The question remained, who had most to gain by manipulating fortune in such a clumsy way? The answer, he suspected, would present itself at the raffle itself. With that in mind, he instructed Sergeant Love to prepare quietly for the draw day, to be present but unobtrusive, and to take note of every hesitation, every furtive glance. "It is not the winning ticket that matters, Love," Purbright explained, "but the way it is claimed. Guilt, you see, has a habit of announcing itself with an eagerness that honesty rarely needs." Love, puzzled but respectful, promised to observe carefully. The following day a further twist unsettled the town. A bundle of ticket stubs was discovered abandoned in an alley behind the drapery. A group of boys rooting about for adventure had found them and triumphantly paraded them through the market square before an adult intervened. The stubs, when collected, bore numbers that overlapped with several books already in circulation. This revelation, the so-called alley find, electrified Flaxborough. It was no longer a matter of duplication in abstract. Here were tangible scraps, physical evidence of tampering. Some said Gedge had thrown them away in haste, others whispered that a rival had planted them to frame him. The debate raged with renewed intensity, and even the Chronicle's editor dared to print a veiled reference, noting that certain irregularities in the raffle preparations are under close scrutiny. For Purbright, the discovery of the stubs was both useful and troubling. Useful because it confirmed deliberate interference. Troubling because it complicated the picture. If Gedge were the culprit, why discard stubs so carelessly, knowing discovery was certain? Unless, of course, the carelessness was not his but another's, seeking to nudge suspicion more firmly toward him. The inspector studied the bundle with patient interest, noting that the ink on the numbers varied in tone, some sharp and black, others faded. He murmured to himself that mischief rarely confined itself to one hand. The town, however, had no such patience. By evening, Gedge was practically condemned in public opinion. His booming laugh, once a sign of hearty good humour, now sounded forced, hollow, almost guilty. Customers avoided his shop, or entered with thinly veiled curiosity to see how he bore the disgrace. He responded with even greater joviality, as though volume could drown suspicion. But Purbright, watching from a discreet distance, saw in the man's eyes a flicker of strain. Gedge was indeed troubled, but whether from guilt or from the crushing weight of rumour was less certain. Thus the stage was set for the raffle itself. The duplications, the suspicious notes, the alley stubs, all had woven a tapestry of doubt so thick that the draw promised not amusement, but revelation. Purbright, calm as ever, prepared to attend, certain that human nature, when placed before the bright light of public scrutiny, would expose itself with all the clarity he required. For in Flaxborough, where gossip travelled swifter than reason, it was not the evidence but the manner of men that revealed the truth. On the morning of the raffle, Inspector Purbright rose earlier than usual, not out of urgency, but from the quiet knowledge that the day promised revelations. The scandal had ripened into that peculiar condition in which Flaxborough excelled, a drama so inflated with gossip that reality itself seemed almost beside the point. By now the duplicated tickets, the suspicious banknotes, and the abandoned stubs in the alley had formed a narrative that everyone believed they understood, though no two versions were alike. Purbright, polishing his spectacles with patient care, reflected that the truth, as always, would likely be both simpler and more absurd than the tales woven in drawing-rooms and shop queues. As he walked through the high street, he observed the townspeople with the mild curiosity of a man examining exhibits at a fair. There was Miss Pumphrey, her bonnet perched like a signal flag, regaling a group of listeners with her latest interpretation that foreign agents had introduced the false tickets to undermine the moral fibre of the parish. There was Mrs. Pringle, more indignant than ever, insisting that the raffle had been fixed against her personally, and that her losses in past years now appeared part of a wider conspiracy. Mr. Willard of the bank, solemn as an undertaker, declared to anyone within earshot that he had long suspected financial irregularities, and would not be surprised if the bishop himself were forced to intervene. Purbright nodded politely as he passed, noting how readily scandal allowed each individual to display their favourite grievance under the guise of civic concern. The raffle was scheduled for the evening, but already the church hall was being prepared. Tables were laden with the prize baskets of fruit, bottles of wine, tins of biscuits, an electric kettle whose cord looked scarcely trustworthy, and, most prominently, the set of cutlery that had become a symbol of the entire affair. Mrs. Henshaw supervised the arrangements with her customary severity, directing volunteers as though preparing for battle. The vicar hovered at her side, his smile feeble, his eyes downcast, as though he hoped by sheer humility to avoid any further accusations. Purbright, observing from the doorway, felt a faint pang of sympathy. The man looked less like a conspirator than a schoolboy awaiting punishment. During the afternoon, the inspector returned to his office and allowed himself an hour of quiet reflection. He arranged the faulty ticket books, the duplicate stubs, and the bundle of suspicious banknotes before him, not as evidence in the forensic sense, but as prompts for contemplation. What linked them was not technical trickery, but human impulse. Someone had sought advantage, but in so clumsy and scattered a way that the attempt itself betrayed desperation rather than calculation. It reminded Purbright of the small frauds he had seen over the years: a grocer weighing apples with his thumb on the scale, a councilman claiming expenses for journeys never made. The motive was rarely wealth. It was the intoxicating pleasure of feeling clever, of outwitting neighbours. Yet in Flaxborough, neighbours were never truly outwitted. They watched too closely and they remembered too long. Purbright's thoughts returned again and again to Gedge. The draper had access, opportunity, and the sort of jovial confidence that might mask dishonesty. Yet something in his manner troubled the inspector. Gedge's booming laugh, his insistence on cheerfulness, did not strike Purbright as the affectations of a guilty man, but as the armour of one too aware of being watched. If Gedge was guilty, he was a poor actor. If innocent, he was a man trapped in the part others had written for him. Either way, the raffle itself would be the stage upon which the truth was finally revealed. He considered how best to guide the performance without seeming to intervene. His role, he reminded himself, was not to accuse, but to observe, to allow human nature to display itself. The guilty, when placed under the bright light of expectation, invariably betrayed themselves not by grand confession, but by some small gesture, a hesitation, a too ready claim. He resolved that his task that evening would be to notice, to catch the subtle tremor when it occurred, and to let it tell him more than any witness statement. As dusk fell, the town gathered for the event. The church hall filled quickly, the air thick with chatter, the scent of polished wood and damp overcoats mingling with the faint aroma of cakes laid out for after the draw. The prizes gleamed under the lamps, each one invested with far greater significance than its value warranted. The vicar mounted the small platform, cleared his throat, and began with a prayer for honesty and goodwill. It was received with the solemnity of a courtroom oath, though more than one person smirked at the irony. Mrs. Henshaw, standing beside him, held the tin for the ticket stubs with the dignity of a magistrate guarding crown jewels. Purbright sat near the back, his expression mild, his eyes attentive. He saw Gedge in the second row, his shoulders square, his laugh conspicuously loud at every jest. He saw Mrs. Hornbeam clutching her tickets nervously, her lips moving as though rehearsing a defence. He saw Miss Pumphrey craning her neck, eager to claim the honour of being first to notice any irregularity. The town had come not so much to win prizes as to witness scandal resolved one way or another. The draw began, numbers were called, prizes claimed. The first few passed without incident: a tin of biscuits to a young shopgirl, a bottle of sherry to the postmaster's wife. Each announcement was met with murmurs, applause, and careful glances to ensure no duplication arose. Purbright watched not the winners but those who did not win, noting who frowned, who sighed, who whispered to neighbours. When at last the number for the cutlery was called, a hush fell. It was a number known to several, for in the weeks of gossip many had compared tickets, and, sure enough, two claimants rose at once, Mrs. Hornbeam and a man from the council, each holding a stub with the same bold figures. The hall erupted in noise, accusations flew, voices rose. Mrs. Henshaw demanded silence, her cheeks flushed with outrage. The vicar, flustered, suggested a coin toss which provoked laughter and further protest. In the midst of the clamour, Purbright kept his eyes on Gedge. The draper had half risen, then sat quickly again, his mouth opening as though to speak, but closing before sound emerged. That flicker of impulse, that aborted gesture, told the inspector more than all the shouting. Here was a man who had expected a different outcome, who had braced himself to intervene, only to find events slipping from his grasp. When order was restored, the prize was withheld pending investigation, and the draw continued in an atmosphere thick with suspicion. The hall's earlier cheer had vanished. Every announcement was met with narrowed eyes, every claim scrutinized. At the end, When the last tin of cocoa was presented, few applauded. The town dispersed into the night, murmuring darkly, convinced that dishonesty had taken root among them. For Purbright, however, the evening had been instructive. He had seen not only the contested claims, but the subtle reactions that accompanied them. The guilty, he knew, had revealed themselves, though not yet in a form the town would recognize. Back in his office, Purbright sat with his notes, considering his next step. He would not act rashly. He would not give the town the spectacle it craved. Instead, he would wait, as he always did, for the guilty to press themselves into confession by the weight of their own missteps. Already, he sensed, the culprit was close to that edge. And when the final slip came, it would be less dramatic than Flaxborough imagined, but all the more decisive for being so small. For in the end, he reflected, human vanity needed no grand exposure. It destroyed itself in whispers, in glances, in the impatient eagerness to grasp what was never truly theirs. The fire morning after the raffle dawned grey and damp, as though the weather itself had chosen to mirror the mood of the town. The scandal had not abated with the drawing of prizes. If anything, it had grown more pungent, for now there were concrete grievances instead of speculation. 2 winners had been announced for 1 prize, accusations had been exchanged in full view of the parish, and Mrs. Henshaw's iron voice had failed to quell the noise. The raffle, which ought to have united the town in mild amusement and modest gain, had ended in discord. To many this was proof enough that someone had interfered, and in Flaxborough, once proof was assumed, only the name of the culprit remained to be agreed upon. Inspector Purbright, entering the police station with his usual unhurried step, was greeted at once by Sergeant Love, who was bursting with theories. Love insisted that the simultaneous claimants for the cutlery could only have been arranged by Gedge. "It stands to reason, sir," he declared, "that if 2 people had the same number, it must have been because he gave it to them. Nobody else handled as many books." Purbright acknowledged the logic, but remained silent, removing his coat and settling into his chair with deliberate calm. He asked Love whether he had noticed the reactions of those in the hall at the moment of dispute. Love admitted he had been too busy noting down the numbers. Purbright smiled faintly and said nothing more, but his eyes betrayed thoughtfulness. For he had noticed the reactions, and they told him more than the numbers ever could. Later that morning, Purbright took a walk through the market square. He made no inquiries, yet conversation flowed toward him regardless, for the town could not resist feeding him its theories. Mrs. Pringle accosted him near the butcher's stall, declaring that she had been vindicated at last, since her suspicions of dishonesty had been proven. The butcher's wife added that she had always mistrusted the vicar's niece, though the young lady had been absent from town for months. Mr. Willard, overhearing, nodded solemnly and remarked that the financial irregularities must surely extend beyond raffles, perhaps even into parish funds. Purbright listened with the air of a man enjoying birdsong. He offered no correction, for gossip was a river that lost strength only when it ran itself out. By midday, he had returned to his office and laid out the disputed ticket stubs from the previous night. He examined them with care, comparing the handwriting, the ink, and the slight impressions left by ballpoint tips. One stub bore a deeper indentation than the others, as though the hand that wrote it had pressed harder, perhaps in agitation. Another showed ink that had bled slightly, suggesting a pen refilled clumsily. These were details unnoticed by the claimants, but they confirmed to Purbright that more than one person had tampered with tickets, or at least that the distribution had been anything but orderly. He tapped his pen against the desk, reflecting that untidiness was often the truest clue of all. Professional criminals concealed their traces, amateurs left smudges and scratches everywhere. In the afternoon, Purbright decided upon a small test. He paid a visit first To Mrs. Hornbeam, who had been one of the disputed claimants, she received him anxiously, fearing accusation. Purbright reassured her at once, telling her that no blame was attached to her. He then asked, in the mildest tone, whether she had considered returning her tickets for inspection. She hesitated, looked flustered, and then produced them from a drawer. As she handed them over, she remarked, almost defensively, that Gedge himself had urged her to keep them safe. Purbright thanked her, noting carefully that her fear seemed directed not at him, but at betraying another. From there, he walked to the council clerk who had also claimed the cutlery. The man, neat and precise, produced his stubs with the satisfaction of one who believed himself unassailable. Yet when Purbright asked whether he had bought the book directly from Gedge, the clerk paused before answering. He admitted that he had, but added quickly that he had purchased it only because Gedge assured him the numbers were lucky. The same word had been used to Mrs. Hornbeam. Purbright filed this repetition away. It was too consistent to be a coincidence. It suggested a deliberate tactic, an attempt to render duplications palatable by disguising them as superstition. Satisfied, the inspector returned to his office, where Sergeant Love awaited him with renewed impatience. Love pressed again for action, insisting that Gedge be questioned formally. Purbright declined, remarking instead that people often revealed more when they were at ease than when they were under pressure. Love sighed, unconvinced, but trusted his superior enough to restrain his eagerness. He asked, however, whether there was anything he might do. Purbright smiled gently and suggested that Love invite Gedge to the station the following morning, not for questioning, but for a routine matter regarding ticket distribution. He instructed Love to prepare tea and biscuits to make the visit seem informal. Love was puzzled, but agreed. That evening, Purbright wrote several notes in his ledger. He recorded not only the duplications, but the manner in which each person had responded to them. Mrs. Hornbeam's nervous deflection, the clerk's too ready precision, Gedge's aborted gesture at the raffle thieves, he believed, were the true evidence. For behaviour, unlike ink and paper, could not be forged. He closed the ledger with quiet satisfaction, convinced that the morning's meeting would bring the final thread to light. When Gedge arrived at the station the next day, he was in his usual loud spirits, greeting the constables with hearty slaps on the back. He accepted tea and biscuits as though he were visiting friends, not the police. Purbright welcomed him with a mild smile, invited him to sit, and began with questions so ordinary that Gedge relaxed at once. How many books had he distributed? Did he recall whom? Had there been any difficulties with the printer? Gedge answered readily, if somewhat vaguely, filling his responses with laughter and anecdotes. Love, watching from the corner, looked impatient, but Purbright seemed content, nodding gently, as though these rambling explanations were precisely what he sought. Then at a quiet moment, Purbright asked a question so casual it might have been overlooked. He wondered aloud whether Gedge had ever considered keeping a few tickets back for himself, just as a memento, you understand. The draper, startled, laughed loudly, but the laugh came half a second too late, and his hand, resting on the arm of the chair, clenched. Purbright's eyes, behind their spectacles, noted the movement. He said nothing, but allowed the silence to stretch until Gedge filled it with more protestations of honesty than the question had required. Love, puzzled, did not see the significance, but Purbright did. For guilt, he knew, revealed itself not in words, but in reflexes. When Gedge departed, still laughing but faintly perspiring, Purbright sat back and reflected on what he had seen. He was not yet ready to confront the man, but the test had confirmed his suspicion. The duplications, the banknotes, the abandoned stubs, all were strands of the same net, and Gedge was caught within it. Yet Purbright also sensed that another hand had touched the scheme, the clumsiness of the execution, the variety of ink and staples, the scattered nature of the evidence all hinted at more than one participant. Whether accomplice or dupe, someone else had aided the mischief. To uncover that role, Purbright knew he must wait a little longer. Human nature, like yeast, requires time to rise, and when it did, the truth would appear as naturally as bread from the oven. So he continued his patient watch, certain that the scandal was nearing its end. The town might clamour for swift justice, but Purbright preferred certainty to speed, for he understood better than most that in Flaxborough guilt never remained hidden long. It always betrayed itself, not in the grandeur of crime, but in the small absurdities of those who believed themselves cleverer than their neighbours. Inspector Purbright spent the evening after Gedge's visit in the quiet company of his own reflections. The town outside his office hummed with speculation, for the Raffle scandal had now overtaken every other subject of conversation. Housewives paused over their washing to exchange rumours. Men at the railway arms rehearsed their own conclusions with a gravity better suited to matters of state, and even the children in the streets devised games in which duplicated tickets served as tokens of treachery. Yet while the town gorged itself on suspicion, Purbright contented himself with a pipe and the steady ordering of facts in his mind. He did not believe in sudden flashes of revelation. He trusted instead to the slow sifting of details until the shape of truth emerged, unforced and undeniable. The interview with Gedge had provided more than enough detail to confirm his instincts. The man's laugh, strained beneath its volume, the slight clench of his hand at the mention of keeping tickets, these were signs more eloquent than any confession. Yet Purbright was careful not to move too quickly. In Flaxborough, the exposure of guilt had to be handled with delicacy. To humiliate a man in public risked not only the culprit's ruin, but the resentment of his neighbours, who disliked seeing their follies displayed too clearly. Justice, in such a place, had to be administered with a courtesy almost theatrical, so that those present could nod gravely and pretend they had suspected all along. To prepare, Purbright paid a quiet call at the vicarage the next morning. The vicar received him with a mixture of relief and dread, eager to be cleared yet fearful of fresh accusations. Mrs. Henshaw, formidable as ever, declared that the scandal had gone on long enough and demanded that the police act. Purbright listened politely, nodding as though in agreement, and then suggested that the parish committee gather the following evening in the church hall, ostensibly to discuss the accounts. The Henshaws agreed, though Mrs. Henshaw's eyes narrowed at the inspector's calm assurance. She seemed to sense, though she could not prove, that some reckoning was near. Leaving the vicarage, Purbright walked slowly through the market square, observing the life of the town with the mild detachment of a naturalist. He noted how Gedge, standing outside his drapery shop, greeted passers-by with forced cheer, pressing bolts of cloth into their reluctant hands. He observed how Mrs. Hornbeam avoided eye contact, her face pale with the worry of being associated too closely with the scandal. He saw Mr. Willard puffing himself up with solemn remarks about financial impropriety, relishing the attention his opinions now commanded. Each figure played a role in the unfolding drama, yet Purbright alone knew that the curtain had not yet fallen. That evening he invited Sergeant Love into his office for a quiet conversation. Love, still eager for decisive action, pressed once more for an arrest. Purbright, with his habitual gentleness, explained that they would wait until the committee meeting. "It is always better, Love," he remarked, "to let the guilty declare themselves. If we pull the thread, it may snap. If we let them tug at it, the whole garment unravels." Love, puzzled but loyal, nodded and resolved to trust his superior's judgment, though he muttered something about the town growing restless. Purbright smiled faintly. Restlessness, he knew, was the very condition in which truth most readily emerged. The following evening, the committee assembled in the church hall, the very place where the raffle had been held. The atmosphere was tense, each member wary of being implicated. Mrs. Henshaw presided at the head of the table, her husband beside her, pale and nervous. Gedge took his seat with an air of exaggerated joviality, slapping the shoulders of those near him, though his laugh was brittle. Caldecott the treasurer shuffled his papers with anxious fingers, while Mrs. Hornbeam sat stiffly, her eyes downcast. Purbright entered quietly, greeted all with a mild bow, and took a seat at the far end, as though merely an observer. Only Love, perched awkwardly near the door, betrayed the sense that something was about to occur. The meeting began with the vicar's faltering attempt to pray for harmony. Mrs. Henshaw then launched into a fierce denunciation of gossip, insisting that the parish's honour had been tarnished by idle talk and that the committee must put an end to it. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, though none dared meet her eye. Gedge laughed loudly and proposed that all accounts be declared sound at once, so the town might move on. His suggestion was met with silence, broken only by Caldecott's nervous cough. Purbright remained still, his hands folded, his eyes resting on the table before him. When at last the room settled, Purbright cleared his throat gently. His voice was quiet, so quiet that those at the far end leaned forward to hear. He spoke not of accusations, but of observations. He described, almost conversationally, how certain ticket books had contained duplications, how bundles had appeared with irregular counts, how stubs had been discovered discarded in an alley. He remarked, with the mildest of smiles, how curious it was that particular words, lucky, for instance, had been used by more than one claimant to justify their confidence in winning. And he noted, as though it were a trivial detail, that certain banknotes, consecutive in number, had found their way into the accounts. He said none of this with drama or emphasis, merely as a recital of facts, like a man describing the weather. As he spoke, the effect on the room was palpable. Mrs. Hornbeam grew paler still, wringing her hands in her lap. Caldecott bowed his head lower over his papers, as though to escape notice. Mrs. Henshaw's lips pressed into a hard line, her eyes darting toward Gedge. And Gedge himself, who had begun by laughing at each observation, now shifted uneasily, his smile faltering. The laughter that followed each remark came slower, less convincing, until at last he merely sat with his arms folded, his face red with suppressed anger. Purbright paused, then continued in the same even tone. He said that in matters such as these, guilt was often revealed not by evidence alone, but by behaviour, the eagerness of some to explain too much, the reluctance of others to speak at all, the careless disposal of things that might otherwise have remained hidden. He let the silence stretch, his eyes resting gently on Gedge, though without accusation. It was enough. The draper shifted, muttered something about being unfairly targeted, and began to protest. But his protest came too quickly, too vehemently, and the very eagerness betrayed him more surely than any evidence could. Mrs. Henshaw seized upon the moment, demanding to know whether Gedge had tampered with the books. Gedge denied it, but his denial was drowned by murmurs around the table. Caldecott, emboldened by the inspector's calm recital, confessed that the irregular banknotes had come only from Gedge's collections. Mrs. Hornbeam admitted that she had sold extra books at his request, though she had not understood why. One by one, the fragments fell into place, not through Purbright's accusation, but through the guilty man's own crumbling defence. The room, which had begun in tense silence, now hummed with indignation directed firmly at Gedge. Purbright, still seated, merely inclined his head. He made no declaration of guilt, no triumphant announcement. He allowed the committee itself to pronounce judgment, for that was the way of Flaxborough. To have the town decide was better than any verdict the police could impose. And in their indignation, they did decide. Gedge's laugh faltered into silence, his face flushed, his shoulders slumped. The game, he seemed to understand, was over. As the meeting dissolved into murmurs and recriminations, Purbright rose quietly, exchanged a polite word with the vicar, and took his leave. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying with it the faint chime of the church clock. Sergeant Love hurried after him, eager to know whether an arrest would follow. Purbright replied mildly that an arrest was hardly necessary. The town itself had delivered its sentence. Love frowned, puzzled, but said nothing more. Purbright walked on, his step unhurried, his thoughts already turning to the paperwork that awaited him. For he knew that in Flaxborough scandals rose and fell like the tide, each leaving behind a residue of suspicion and memory, but life itself flowed on, undisturbed. And soon enough, another small folly would present itself, demanding once again his quiet attention. The days following the committee meeting carried an air of anticlimax, as though Flaxborough, having exhausted itself on speculation, now found the scandal less entertaining than it had imagined. The guilty man had been revealed, not through a dramatic arrest, but through the steady crumbling of his own denials in the presence of neighbours. That perhaps made the exposure more effective. There was no room for him to claim persecution or error. The town itself had witnessed the collapse, and towns were never inclined to doubt their own judgment. Gedge continued to open his drapery shop, but the booming laugh that once greeted customers now sounded brittle, and fewer lingered by the counter. His prosperity, so recently remarked upon with envy, shrank under the chill of suspicion. The paint on his doorway seemed already to peel, though it had been fresh only weeks before. In Flaxborough, disgrace aged things faster than weather. The vicar and his wife fared differently. Public opinion, quick to condemn, was just as quick to absolve once a more convenient target presented itself. Mrs. Henshaw, though shaken by the ordeal, adopted the air of a vindicated general, certain that her vigilance had preserved the Raffles' honour. The vicar, pale but relieved, resumed his rounds with something resembling confidence, though his smile still carried the fragility of a man who feared the next rumour might again fix upon him. Parishioners greeted him more warmly than before, perhaps ashamed of their earlier suspicion, though in truth it was less shame than relief at having redirected blame elsewhere. Flaxborough prized stability, and now that stability had been restored, even at Gedge's expense, the parish was content to move on. Inspector Purbright observed these changes with his customary detachment. He had no interest in vengeance or triumph. His satisfaction lay in the quiet alignment of fact, in the restoration of balance to a community that thrived in order disguised as civility. He knew that the punishment inflicted upon Gedge by gossip, cold shoulders and dwindling trade would be harsher and longer lasting than anything the courts might impose. He saw no need for further interference. His task was done the moment the guilty hand revealed itself in a clenched fist and a faltering laugh. Still, the inspector could not help but reflect on the affair with a certain dry amusement. What had been at stake, after all? A set of cutlery, a bottle of sherry, a basket of fruit prizes of such modest value that their manipulation seemed absurd. Yet beneath that absurdity lay something more instructive, the hunger of human vanity, the restless desire to appear fortunate, to stand above neighbours if only for the length of an applause. In Flaxborough, where reputation was both currency and theatre, such vanity could distort even the simplest amusement. Purbright was not surprised. He had long known that the smallest prizes drew out the largest follies. Sergeant Love, however, was less philosophical. He expressed disappointment that no formal charges would be laid, that the culprit would face no trial, no handcuffs, no satisfying declaration of guilt. Purbright listened patiently and then explained that the law, though powerful, was not always the most effective remedy. "A man convicted in court, love," he observed, "may serve his sentence and be forgotten. A man condemned by his neighbours is seldom allowed to forget. Which punishment do you think is more severe?" Love considered this, frowned, and eventually nodded, though without enthusiasm. He preferred the tangibility of rules to the subtleties of social judgment. Yet even he could see that Gedge, bustling forlornly behind his counter, bore already the unmistakable look of a man serving life without remission. The town itself soon adjusted. The raffle proceeds, once in doubt, were counted and declared intact, save for the irregular notes which Caldecott quietly replaced with his own. The prizes were distributed to their rightful winners, though the cutlery remained a sore subject. In the end, Mrs. Henshaw decreed that it should be donated to the church kitchen, a gesture of such unassailable virtue that even Mrs. Pringle could not object. Indeed, the decision pleased many, for it meant the scandal's most symbolic object no longer belonged to any individual but to the community. Thus the cutlery, polished and neatly stored, became an exhibit in the parish cupboards, a silent reminder of folly repurposed into utility. Miss Pumphrey continued to boast that she had been the first to detect irregularity, though her audience dwindled. Mrs. Pringle, though deprived of her favourite grievance, soon found a new one in the matter of hymn selections, which she declared were increasingly unsuited to modern times. Mr. Willard returned to his solemn routines at the bank, though with a little more deference from neighbours who admired his early suspicion of financial impropriety. Mrs. Hornbeam, anxious to repair her reputation, gave a handsome donation to the parish fund, and was rewarded with approving nods at the grocer's. In these small adjustments, Flaxborough stitched itself back into its customary pattern, a quilt of grievances and reconciliations, each square familiar, each seam visible. For Purbright, the conclusion of the affair was marked not by public acknowledgment, but by the resumption of paperwork. He spent an afternoon in his office, filing reports, updating ledgers, and noting the lessons learned. He wrote without flourish, merely recording that the raffle scandal had been resolved through the exposure of irregularities traced to Mr. Gedge, whose actions, though not prosecuted, had been sufficiently dealt with by the community. He added that no further police action was required, and closed the file with a soft click. To any outsider, the report would have seemed dry, even perfunctory. Yet within its lines lay the story of a town's vanity, its gossip, and its unerring instinct for punishment. As dusk settled over Flaxborough, the inspector leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a moment's quiet. Through the window he could hear the faint hum of voices in the street, the ordinary conversations of a town returning to itself. Somewhere a child laughed, somewhere a shop door closed, somewhere a dog barked at the passing of a cart. Life resumed, indifferent to the scandal that had so recently consumed it. Purbright smiled faintly, reflecting that this was always the way. Human folly burned brightly for a time, then faded into the ordinary, leaving behind little more than a tale to be retold on winter evenings. He extinguished his lamp, locked the drawer, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp leaves and distant smoke. He walked slowly through the square, nodding politely to those who greeted him, pausing to admire the church tower outlined against the darkening sky. There was satisfaction in such ordinary sights, in the knowledge that order, however fragile, had been restored. Tomorrow would bring fresh complaints, small disputes, the endless murmuring of a town that thrived on its own importance. And when they came, he would listen, patient and polite, never rushing, never showing all his thoughts until the moment was right. For now, however, there was peace. And in that peace, Purbright found the quiet reward of his profession, not triumph, not glory, but the steady reassurance that even the smallest scandals, once understood, revealed the enduring patterns of human nature. He smiled to himself, adjusted his hat, and walked on into the evening, a solitary figure content to let the town carry on its endless performance while he prepared, silently, for the next curtain to rise.